Listen, a sower went out to sow. And as he sowed, some seed fell on the path, and the birds came and ate it up. Other seed fell on rocky road, where it did not have much soil, and it sprang up quickly, since it had no depth of soil. And when the sun rose, it was scorched, and since it had no root, it withered away. Other seed fell among thorns, and the thorns grew up and choked it, and it yielded no grain. Other seed fell into good soil, and brought forth grain, growing up and increasing and yielding 30 and 60 and 100-fold. Let anyone with ears to hear listen.
How many of you have heard this parable before? Perhaps you've heard a sermon about it, or maybe studied it on your own. And if you have, chances are the questions you're asking as you read the text is something like, what does this text mean for me? How is it relevant or applicable in my own context? And those are good questions, but they're not the questions that I'll be helping us think about today. Instead, I want to help us understand some things about the historical and literary context of this text so that we can ask how this text might have sounded to those who first encountered it. To guide our exploration today, I want to pose three questions. 1. What about Mark's story would have sounded like good news to Israel? 2. What would the story have sounded like to Roman ears? And 3, why does Mark's story have a surprise ending? So let's begin with Israel's story. Perhaps you noticed this week that the first sentence of Mark's gospel isn't really a sentence at all. It has no verb. In fact, it's the title of the narrative, the beginning of the good news of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. Now, note that the Greek word euangelion can be translated either as good news or gospel. So what about the ensuing narrative would have seemed like good news to a first century Jew? To answer that question, we first have to grasp the bad news. Since 63 BC, the Jews had been under the thumb of the world superpower of the day, Rome. But the bad news goes back even further. Before Rome, the Jews had been ruled by Syria, before that Greece, before that Persia, before that Babylon. In fact, Israel had not been an independent nation since 587 BC. Now, nobody likes to be ruled by someone else, but the pagan oppression of Rome was particularly grievous for Jews because they viewed themselves as God's covenant people, a people intended by God to be a blessing to all the families of the earth.
I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you, and make your name great, so that you will be a blessing.
Just as the human family, and indeed creation itself, was cursed as a result of Adam and Eve's disobedience, so now all the world will be blessed as a result of Israel's obedience. Another way to think about it is this, that the purpose of the covenant is to address the problem of evil and restore goodness to creation. As the narrative progresses, however, God's plan to restore creation through the covenant appears constantly in jeopardy. The root problem is Israel's repeated inability to prove loyal to the covenant. The intention of the covenant was that Israel, through its distinct mode of life and pattern of worship, would demonstrate to the rest of the world what it meant to be authentically human. As the prophets repeatedly warned, however, Israel's behavior was often indistinguishable from its neighbors and oftentimes worse. So as a consequence of this infidelity, Israel found itself subjugated to its enemies, Egypt, Babylon, Syria, and finally Rome. So this presents God with a real dilemma. Now, there's an expression you may have heard, to be caught on the horns of a dilemma. So the first part of the dilemma for God is this, that God can't simply turn his back on Israel, because to do so would be to forsake the covenant to which God has bound himself. And thus God would prove himself to be unfaithful, a contradiction of his very nature. Clearly then, God must act. And so God delivers Israel from Egypt, an event known as the Exodus. The Exodus was the defining moment in Israel's history, when the God of creation delivered his people from slavery, thus proving his faithfulness to the covenant. Following this dramatic deliverance from Egypt, God led Israel to Mount Sinai, where he gave them the Torah, which we can translate as law or instruction, the most widely known component of which is the Ten Commandments. This giving of the Torah to Israel can be seen as giving Israel a new vocation, a new calling, a new sense of what it means to be faithful within this covenant relationship. The Exodus, God's deliverance of Israel from oppression and renewing their vocation to the covenant, this moment becomes a defining, identity-shaping moment for Israel, which is remembered every year in the festival of the Passover. The memory of this event burned within the prophet Isaiah when Israel again, in the 6th century BC, found itself in exile in Babylon. And so the prophet speaks words of hope to the exiles in Babylon, words that evoke the Exodus.
A voice cries out, "In the wilderness, prepare the way of the Lord. Make straight in the desert a highway for our God."
And every valley shall be lifted up, and every mountain and hill be made low. The uneven ground shall become level, and the rough places a plain.
Sound familiar? These are the words Mark uses to introduce the prophetic ministry of John the Baptist at the very beginning of his gospel. Now, pay close attention to the visual imagery. Valleys are being filled in, mountains are being bulldozed, the rough, uneven ground is being smoothed over. So what's going on? God is about to build a highway. Just as God led Israel out of slavery in Egypt and out of exile in Babylon, so now a new exodus is afoot. This then is the good news for Israel. God is once again going to bring freedom to his covenant people. Now, how is this supposed to happen? In broad strokes, the idea was that God would designate or anoint a leader who would overthrow the Roman oppressors and restore the nation of Israel. In Hebrew, the term for such a person is Mashiach, which is where we get the word Messiah. By the way, if you translate the Hebrew Mashiach into Greek, you get Christos, which is where we get the English word Christ. In Israel's scriptures, this royal figure is sometimes referred to as God's son. Psalm 2, for example, came to be interpreted as a prophecy of a coming Messiah who would destroy Israel's pagan enemies like a piece of pottery. You can hear echoes of this messianic psalm in the very title of Mark's Gospel, the beginning of the good news of Jesus Christ, Christos, or anointed, the Son of God. You can also detect echoes in his account of Jesus' baptism, in which the heavens are torn open and a voice proclaims, "You are my Son, the Beloved." So right from the start, Mark's Gospel evokes the hope that God will once again prove faithful to his covenant people. Just as God delivered us from Egypt and Babylon, so once again, God will deliver us from our pagan oppressors. A new exodus is afoot, Mark suggests, and this is good news indeed.